Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Unboxable Unstoppable podcast. As always, we are very excited to have a guest with me today. This guest is quite special to me. We're very old friends, and we've had this kind of parallel life of various subcultural things throughout mostly youth, but still our musical tastes intersect. Our clubbing life used to intersect. We actually worked together in a really interesting place called Remo long time ago when we were extremely young. And I'm very excited to present Kimberley Crofts, and I will let Kimberley explain who she is and what she's doing, and then we'll just have a chat like we always do. So please enjoy this episode. Kimberley, hello.
Hello, good morning.
How are you?
I'm good. As I said before, a little bit tired. I think I might have had too much MSG in my stir fry last night. So, but bear with me.
Yeah, no worries. I'm sure many of us will understand that moment.
I'm sure.
So first question, who are you? What do you do? How did you come to do it? Tell us a bit about Kimberley Crofts.
Wow. Well, life at the moment is a little different to what it used to be, but I'm guessing that that's exactly the same for pretty much everybody in the world. But last year, when the pandemic hit, I was working freelance. I'm a designer. I'll get to that in a second. I was working freelance, and because of the pandemic, all of my freelance work dried up. And I had been wanting to do a PhD for quite some time, but it just had never been the right time. And all of a sudden, I didn't have any work. I had a lot of free time on the horizon. I thought, well, now is the time to do this thing. So I put in an application, and I was lucky enough to be accepted and to get a scholarship, which was pretty amazing. And so I decided to do this thing that I'd been wanting to do for a while. I had also heard from a lot of people that it was very important to make sure that whatever you choose to do for a PhD, you're actually really passionate about it, because you have to spend so much time with the subject. And that subject is something I am really passionate about, because it's related to climate change. And it's also related to people and to helping people be in charge of their own lives a lot more. What I'd seen at the 2019 federal election was that a lot of people in coal mining areas had been told by the federal government that the only possible future for them and their families was coal mining. And even though around 85% of people at the time across Australia believed that we should take action on climate, people in these coal mining areas still voted for their Liberal National Party, because they'd been told by the LNP that coal had a future.
Wow.
And like a lot of people, especially inner city latte sipping people such as myself, could not understand what had gone on.
Yes.
And I needed to know what had gone on, because I just couldn't see that we could keep going this way. The longer that people continue to support the burning of fossil fuels, the deeper in trouble we're going to get. So I thought, well, this is the thing. This is the thing that I need to look at. And so that is my PhD. I'm looking at a community that is dominated by coal, and working with a community group there to help the broader community be more involved in planning their future post-coal.
This is incredible, Kimberley. So I didn't know this. I'm hearing this for the first time, even though I follow you on socials and I see what you post, and it often resonates with me. I don't often take a deep dive into what you're doing, forgive me. But this is amazing. And I'm understanding now a little bit why we're speaking. And when you were just explaining that, I was getting chills about it, because what you're doing is you're interfacing it, from the way I see it, forgive my layman's perspective, but you're interfacing between literally the coal face, literally the real face of fossil fuels in our world, and the potential that we have in the future to make a change that involves being better custodians of our world. And that is no mean feat, especially when we're up against, as you say, very, very powerful political forces, very powerful misunderstandings and misconstrued information and misinformation that is rife in our world. I just think, first of all, I just want to give you a big cheerleading and just say, oh my goodness, how incredible and what great work you're doing. And I am my blog, which has been running a really long time, is just a very informal spruiker of the Climate Council. So, you know, the first thing I will say to people out there is definitely educate yourself and listen to this podcast, because this is really important conversation. But also get involved, even if it's just like a couple of bucks a week, a couple of bucks a month, or sharing information on socials. If you don't have the money, get involved. Climate Council is a really good place to start in Australia, but there's millions of those things. So please keep going. I interrupted you, but this is so important. So I'm so glad we're talking about it.
And organisations like the Climate Council, I believe, have had their funding cut progressively over the years because of a federal government who are ideologically attached to coal and to fossil fuels. So
and that's crucial, because they're an independent body and an independent voice, which we need on all of our major issues, not just this one, but particularly this one, because without nature functioning, we're in trouble, you know, in a lot of ways. So it's not just a financial issue; it's a survival issue. So let's keep going. I love what you're doing. Thank you for sharing it with us. Yeah,
it's and some people might be a little bit unsure about what a designer is doing in this area.
Right.
So design. I used to be a graphic designer, which is probably the type of design that most people are familiar with, or fashion design or interior design. But now I practice what's more commonly called service design, which is literally the designing of services. And people might think, wait a second, how is that possible? But if you think about design as making things better and making plans to make things better, then it's easier to understand probably how designing a dress might be the same as designing a public service. You're basically trying to make things better. So in the case of what I'm doing in the Hunter Valley with this coal community is helping them to design a better life, and a life that doesn't involve coal.
And I feel like we're all life designers in a way. I feel like we all do this every day, don't we?
Absolutely true. There is some theorists who say that everyone is a designer. And there's, it's a spectrum, right? There's people who get paid for it, who are experts, but literally everybody designs their life. Everybody at some stage makes plans to make things better.
Right.
Yeah. So, and there's a really nice word that I've learned during the PhD, which is welding, which is a nice way of think of it. So when you design, you're welding, so you're creating worlds. And one of the things that not enough designers do, and probably more product designers than anybody else, is think about what happens to the things that they design after. So what happens when products end? We were talking earlier about our computers, what happens when we're done with our computers? A lot of the time when people are designing, they're not thinking about that end process. There's a great book called Ends, if anyone's interested, by my old boss at Nokia, Joe McLeod. And it talks a lot about how, because we don't think about how things end, we don't necessarily design what it is well enough. And that could be anything from a product all the way to life. I mean, how many people like to think of their funeral?
I know. That's a thing, isn't it? We're not good with endings in Western society. I feel like we're really good at growth.
Yeah.
It's the entropy and atrophy thing, right? And we're not good at the entropy. We're not good at endings. And it's so important.
And there's a lovely designer by the name of Cassie Robinson in the UK, and she does a lot of work in public services. And she introduced me to this concept called the Berkana two-loop model, Berkana. And it's a really nice way of looking at the cycle of life, that there is a time where something ends.
Beautiful.
And that you if you there's that ad on TV, it's for a superannuation company, and the people like loop their hands together.
Oh, nice.
It's like that. That's what it is, right? So you imagine there's one half of a circle curving down, and one circle curving up.
Yeah, got
and
it.
as something ends, then there's people whose role should be the composting.
That's so
thinking
cool.
about how can we take what was before and compost it so that we can make something new from it.
Beautiful.
It's a really lovely model. I think you'd like it a lot. And then there's also, I think there's another role in there, which is the midwife, which is then making something of that new life.
Birthing.
Yeah. It's a really, really lovely model. It's one of the ones that I'll be looking at, because I think too often in the sort of work that I do, designers too often, like you said, growth, innovation, the new, everyone's so focused on that they forget that they're working with people's lives.
Right. And it's beautiful also to think about it as a process rather than a hard line sort of chapter. It's not like something begins or ends. It's not that black and white, like it's grey. There's a process, and there's a sort of forward and backward, toing and froing kind of thing that occurs because we're human. We are part of nature. We don't work in full stops and hard lines, even though that's the way our world has kind of evolved to think about things. It's not actually very real.
No.
So I think what's beautiful about these, I'm very big on circles. I'm all about circles, because things are circular, and we sort of have these revolving circles in our lives all the time, and we go forward, we go back, we go up, we go down. That's the way that things work, circular motion. It's a martial arts principle as well. I'm a martial artist, and it's a very important one, and it's one that we sort of think in very linear fashion. I think often in our sort of Western philosophies are quite linear. So I do really like remembering those sort of more circular models.
Yeah, Western philosophy, very linear and very objective.
Right.
You need to be distanced from things to understand them.
Dare I say it, very masculine.
Very masculine traditionally. And it's really interesting actually going into the academy and finding that there's still this resistance to ways of knowing that aren't this clinical, scientific, rigorous, objective, distanced model. And there's definitely people who are doing who are making inroads. And there's also a tiny, tiny, tiny bit of Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and thinking that are coming into the academy as well, which is really helping open people's eyes, particularly to how important it is to develop relations between yourselves and with nature to really understand what is going on.
Right. And I use that language. I borrowed that language from First Nations understanding, Aboriginal understanding, actually, from what I know of understanding in Aboriginal culture, is to borrow that concept of being a custodian. I actually use that when I describe my mission in Soul Mama Hub, is to become better custodians of ourselves, our families, and our environment. And I feel like that's a concept that is so important.
Yeah, it's not ownership. You're not trying to dominate and to own something and to keep it for yourself. You're thinking about 6-7 generations ahead of you.
Right. There's a beautiful there's a concept called the children's fire, which is have you heard about this? It's a guy in the UK, in Totnes, which is a kind of like the Byron Bay of Devon, and he's a fantastic, I'm just struggling to think of his name, but I will put his book on the Soul Mama bookshelf.
Rob Hopkins?
No.
Not the Transition Town guy?
No, he's amazing, but no. This guy, Tim someone, I'll think of it, but he started a community called Embercombe, and they run training, and he's also written books, and he was mandated by a Native American elder to take a concept that is a Native American concept into the corporate world. And he has done this incredible job of taking that knowledge, and it's the understanding that every decision we make, politically or socially, we need to act as if we are consulting our children, our children's children, for 7 generations ahead. So it's every decision must be made with those descendants in mind. And it's a beautiful concept.
And imagine if all of corporate land was thinking that way,
Right.
not with endless growth for the current generation and no one else.
Right. So that's what he was. Mac McCartney is his name, and he was doing that work for quite some time. And he's now written books, and yeah, it's really well worth checking out. But I've got his book, The Children's Fire, which sort of outlines it, and it's that same concept of just we need to house our decisions and our understanding and our choices. And this comes back down to just daily choices. We're not talking only about big concepts in big corporate contexts. We're talking also about the choices we make daily, and that it's not always about making a big change on a global scale. It's sometimes about making a small change and starting right where we're at.
Absolutely. And it's all linked. And there's obviously a lot of criticism about how people have been convinced that recycling is enough for them to solve the climate crisis.
Sure.
And we really need to be taking action at all scales. But for some people, it's just not possible. And I don't think that anybody should feel guilty about not being able to chain themselves to a bulldozer and
right.
Things like that. But, you know, we have to be able to think across scales, across time.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, there's a fantastic TED Talk, Sydney TEDx talk on recycling and some of the issues with recycling. But it's still really important to do it, and it's still really important to see the waste that we produce. At the very least, when you recycle, you become aware of how much non-degradable, well, if you're a composter, you do anyway, how much non-degradable stuff you produce. Like if you separate, you know, the garbage from the garbage and the garbage from the garbage, you start to see what's there.
Yeah.
And that already brings a transformation of awareness. And that already will open your eyes to something and may lead to some change in time. And that's all moving in the right direction. For me, it's about, you know, which direction are you heading? Are you producing more waste or less than yesterday? Are you producing, you know, like I said, it moves in circles, but let's start moving in the right direction and, you know, start from where you're at.
I think reduce is the R word that people forget about a bit too much. I have a friend who is a zero waste fashion designer.
Fantastic.
And he, over the last few years, has become more aware about how the growth of the industry in fabric that's made from recycled PET bottles is actually not doing anything to reduce the amount of PET in the world.
Right.
It's just created a market for it.
And then what do we do with that as well? You know, like that's kind of the next thing. And I think that's the thing. As we get more aware and as we become more conscious, we start to think a little bigger and bigger and bigger. And that's really important.
Yeah, this year it being a little bit different from other years. Now that I'm on a student scholarship, I've been even more thrifty. But I've always been relatively thrifty. I grew up in that kind of a household. But, you know, I've actually been darning the holes in my T-shirts and my socks, you know, not just going, oh, okay, I should buy a new pair because they're perfectly fine. And I'm not seeing anybody anyway. So,
yeah, it's brilliant, isn't it? Once you start thinking like that, it's actually quite hard to get rid of anything.
Yeah.
I've been fixing chairs. So I bought these $5 chairs on Facebook that had been sitting in a garage. They're like beautiful you know, like mid-century modern, gorgeous vinyl, you know, walnut chairs. But they were falling apart. And the hilarious thing is if you come to my house, like you quite likely could be sitting on a chair that's really dodgy. So I'm constantly fixing these chairs. You know, one of them's sitting at the bottom of my stairs at the moment, but I can't get rid of them because I love them. And I'm like, why would I buy something new if I've got these? They're so cool. And I just keep finding new ways of fixing them. And then the other day I've got one of those armchairs as well with the original fabric. You know, it's this like fuzzy kind of green-brown stripe, you know, those ones, Terry, sort of amazing. And it fell apart and I was like, oh, so it took me 3 weeks to work out how to fix that one. But I did, borrowed a couple of clamps from the neighbour and, you know, there's ways. And that's the thing. I wouldn't always do that. I'm not always able to do the most ecological choice, but I look for them. And once you start looking, it's there like anything, you know.
Yeah. The word convenience is something that is one of my most hated words because I think it is something that people use a little bit too much as an excuse for unsustainable behaviours.
Yes.
And I know that everybody's lives are busy and that there's pressure, and that sometimes it's just too hard to do something because it feels inconvenient. But convenience means that you drive to the shops instead of walking. Convenience means that you buy apples that are pre-cut in a plastic bag,
Yes.
etc. And I think it's just become, especially in the West, it's become something that we've convinced ourselves that we need, rather than taking time to do things.
Yes, I agree. And
so you fixing that chair, like, that takes time. It probably took you about as much time as it would have to research a new chair and go and buy it at a shop. But you're doing something with your hands, you're doing something valuable, you've taken the time to actually repair.
I think what's interesting about that is the convenience thing often robs us of a lot of joy. I mean, the joy of, and I'm a shocker for this, I'm not a baker, you know, so I often buy packet cakes. And I try to buy the ones that have got paper bags and not plastic. Yeah. And I try to, you know, I do it in a kind of a semi-conscious way. But actually, when I do go that extra mile and have another crack at baking from scratch, it's so much fun. Like, it's so satisfying. And the same with when you find ways of reusing or repurposing things in your home, like, it's so much fun, that creative process, and so satisfying. And I think a lot of fulfillment that we could have, we don't have, because we just miss that opportunity, you know. And it's a real shame sometimes, isn't it?
Yeah, I can sew. It's one of the things that my mum taught me, one of my most favourite skills.
Fantastic.
So, and like, I can sew really well. Like, I can sew trousers with pockets, you know, like, it's
amazing.
So, proper sewing. And I was making my school uniforms, like, through high school. So, and it's something that is just so rewarding to think, oh, like, I have actually made this. It's very, very rewarding.
That's fantastic. It's a beautiful thing.
Yeah. Dad taught me to whistle and Mum taught me to sew.
Oh, how wonderful. And the thing is, I think we often, if we weren't taught those things, you know, and a lot of us weren't, like, my mother's an amazing seamstress, but I'm not. And
I didn't know that about your mum. Okay.
Yeah, she's amazing. But because her parents were tailors, like, not tailors, they owned a fashion line. In fact, my grandmother for years was the lady in the shop, which was Karina Boutique, which was Underlay Girls in the Cross. Oh, wow. So they're well known in King's Cross, red light district of Sydney. So, like, that was my grandfather's business, was, you know, what they called schmutters. It's like what the Jewish German refugees did. They came to Sydney, they dominated the fashion industry, and they made clothes. Factories, you know, it was named after my mum. It was called Vivian, was their label. So yeah, it's really cool. So she knew how to sew. Like, that was not, you know, number one. So she's, until the day my grandmother died, she was making her clothes, custom making them, you know, like. Yeah. But I didn't get it. Like, I learned a little bit, but I didn't get it. But now I'm like, oh, I kind of wish I did. I mean, it's a super hipster thing to do now, isn't it? Sew your clothes, like.
Totally. Well, there's such lovely patterns and fabrics and stuff out there available now. So yeah, it can get a little addictive.
So I love the way we're talking about these things, because they're all actually a massive part of the idea of transition. So can you talk to me a little bit about that? What is that idea? I know you've mentioned it.
Yeah. So the umbrella term for what I'm working in is sustainable transitions, and a transition is a change. It's a change from one thing to another. Some people say that transition is more of a sort of incremental change compared to transformation, which is much more radical. And there's views that what we need is complete systems transformation because things aren't really working. Yeah. But in terms of people, that transformation can be incredibly disruptive. So transition is the word that people have decided to use for this process, which is transitioning away from fossil fuel as our key energy source.
And there was a movement, as you mentioned briefly before, there's a movement in the UK, transition towns, right?
And there is actually a transition Bondi as well. I don't know if you know.
I am aware. Yes, very cool. Is it Lance, the guy that runs that? Yeah, I used to have a little bit to do with it. They do great films and Fantastic stuff. Yeah. And you'd be surprised actually, wherever you live, there may be a transition movement group.
And so they've got a really excellent community garden here behind a apartment building just up the road from me. Every transition town is different, because it's very much about the context. It's very much about being rooted in the place that it's at. So what's appropriate for this place to help us become more resilient and more self-reliant. And I don't know all of the principles inside out, but I guess that's the key thing, I believe, is how can we make sure that we're not dependent on these global systems of fossil fuel generation, of food supply chains, that sort of thing.
Yeah. Which is an incredible goal, really, considering the way the world is.
Yeah. Did you ever get a Brixton pound?
No.
So they had in Brixton, the transition movement in Brixton had a currency that you could only spend in Brixton.
Oh, fantastic.
So what happened was it kept money within the Brixton area. So you could pay your house painter in Brixton pounds, and then they would have to then go and buy more paint from the local hardware store.
I love it.
Yeah. And Bowie was on the 10 quid Brixton pound.
Oh, that's so awesome.
Yeah.
David Bowie on the 10 quid. I love that.
Brixton boy. Yeah.
So brilliant.
If you Google it, you can see it. It's a Ziggy Stardust picture.
Oh, fantastic. What a beautiful thing.
Yeah.
And look, there's lots of ways we do that, I think. Naturally, we do local exchanges of various things. We do exchanges between neighbours of various things, if we're gardeners particularly.
Right.
There's lots of ways we do that, but to formalise that into a system is so cool.
Yeah. Yeah, we're getting minestrone from our neighbours for lunch today.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Yeah.
So tell me a bit about, I love how we've kind of just meandered around this topic so beautifully, but to bring it back to what you're doing, because I think what you're doing is super special. I'd like to understand a little bit about what are the anticipated rewards and results that may occur from what you're doing with your PhD and with the community.
It's interesting that you asked this, because right at the beginning, one of my supervisors said to me, Kimberley, what's at stake for you?
A great question.
Isn't that a good question? And it's super important for a designer who is going into a community that is not their own to consider this question deeply. And it brings up a whole bunch of things about what right do I have to go into this community? Am I being paternalistic in wanting to help? You see this in a lot of international development contexts with white saviorism, where white people, well-meaning white people, go in and try and help people that they see as more vulnerable than themselves.
The road to hell and all that.
Yeah. So that's something that I've been considering quite a lot. What's my position in this? What do I have at risk that I am putting on the table to do this work? And so I looked quite deeply at who I am. There's this great academic in the US named Leslie Ann Noel, who has created this thing called a positionality wheel, where you question yourselves about who you are, what race you are, what gender you identify as, what class you might be now, what class you were when you were growing up.
Oh, how interesting.
And it's something that as a white person, I've never done because I haven't had to. We consider ourselves as the neutral party from which we compare everybody else, right?
In inverted commas, normal.
Yeah.
We don't have a culture.
We don't have, exactly. But looking at that and thinking, okay, so who am I and why is this thing, why is helping a coal community so important to me? And I was thinking about my childhood and about how I grew up in a small coastal town on the north coast of New South Wales, and hippie parents, and I went to protests from a very early age against decisions that were being made about our community that weren't going to work for us. So they wanted to put an ocean outfall on our headland. And the place where I grew up is the most southerly point of Great Barrier Reef corals. And an ocean outfall there would have been just devastating for that wildlife. So that was my first protest at like 8 or something. And so that happened. There was things about the neoliberalisation of schools. I remember protesting against the Education Minister, Terry Metherall, in the late 80s. And I remember my parents having their house taken away from them by the government, because the government had created this thing called a home fund loan, where they'd given low-income earners very, very low-interest home loans to build a house. And then the government realised that they couldn't make any money from it, so they took all of the houses back.
Oh, my goodness, how ridiculous.
Yeah, Mum and Dad still live in the house because they're hippies. It's a little bit of a different house, and the government didn't understand it. So
fantastic.
But they're now renting the house that they designed and built back from the government. Wow. But all of these things made me realise that I really resent outside people making decisions for others and not giving people any role at all in being able to make decisions about their own lives.
So agency became a thing for you.
Yeah. And then obviously there's an irony, right? Because I'm an outsider wanting to come in to the hunter.
But you're doing it in a different way.
I'm very aware of of my place as an outsider.
Sure.
And you've been using the word custodian. I use the word steward.
Nice.
Or what I'm thinking about doing. So I am going to help steward this community through a journey that they're on already. So I'm joining in with what they're already doing.
That's beautiful. So you're a collaborator.
Yeah. So my position is not like this sage on a stage.
You're not leading it, you're collaborating.
Exactly.
You're stewarding. Yeah, understand.
Yeah. And then the other thing is that I actually do have coal mining in my family. My grandmother was doing our family history. She's now died, but my aunt has taken it on. My great-great-grandfather was killed in a coal mining accident in Port Kembla in 1902.
Wow, that's crazy, isn't it?
Yeah, and I I sort of knew that there was coal mining, but I didn't realise that he died. And so it's interesting to think that is part of.
You've got a score to settle.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, my goodness.
Keep it in the ground, people.
Yeah, that's amazing. And how wonderful that process. I'm really interested in the Leslie Ann. That sounds really interesting. Yeah. Positionality.
It does with students a lot, so it's a really simple process. But
it's fantastic. What a great exercise. Thank you. And I guess the other part of what I'm interested in is, so Kimberley, as far as I know, you don't have any children.
No.
And a lot of my listeners and a lot of the people involved, well, all of the people involved in the membership that I run, the Soul Mama Hub, are mothers. So I guess I'm really interested in, how does this, as someone who watches women experience motherhood, I'm aware you would have people around you who've had children, probably more than haven't, if the statistics are anything to go by. And if we're thinking about women our age, you know, and I'd love to know, what impact do you see that having? We're jumping around a little bit. I love what we're talking about, but I also want to know, what do you observe and what do you perceive about the way that motherhood and parents sit in all of this?
It's interesting. One of the things that I've noticed over the years in not having children is just how isolated people who have children can become.
Yeah.
Because we don't live in big family units anymore.
Right.
We've convinced ourselves that living in 2.5 kids in a house in the suburbs is the most ideal form of life.
And separating old people from their families and putting them in strange places and having babies in hospitals and all of those things. Yeah.
And I see that, and that's one of the things that I find is the start of isolation in communities, which then leads to a sort of othering where you care about the people just in your household, and this happens even if you're not in that sort of a family unit, but it's just it's so easy to become isolated from one another, which means that when thinking about a community, what is a community? I'm not sure if I'm really getting there. Let me think a little bit more deeply about this.
I think you're really touching on something though, like the othering of mothering. There's definitely something in that. And I know certainly for myself that it is really easy to get caught up in our little worlds and forget our place in the bigger, wider one. And also just forget who we are, forget who we are in essence amongst all of that. Just as a practical day-to-day, we can spend so much of our days pouring out ourselves into our children, into our work, into all the things. And then what happens over time is we kind of lose that practice. We lose that practice of self-awareness. We lose that practice of being aware of nature and our place in it, of being the custodians that we are. And that's, I think, for me anyway, I can only speak from my own experience really, but that's where I got lost.
And there's so much pressure, and I think I've definitely have observed that with friends. It's sort of okay, I'll see you when they're 10, and it's sad, because I just see this person that I used to love sort of just disappear.
Yeah, it's really tough.
On the plus side, I've seen them all emerge again.
Yeah,
much more strong and fierce people.
Right. What's that about, do you think?
I think that's a rallying against the social pressure of being this person that we have decided is mother in society. There's so much pressure on mothers to be this perfect person, and you're criticised for wanting to do it full-time, you're criticised for wanting to do it part-time, you're criticised for doing breastfeeding wrong, for doing this, for doing that. I cannot fathom how much pressure mothers must be under socially.
Yeah. And internally, because I think you cannot even realise at the beginning of your motherhood journey often that the amount of that you've internalised. And so the pressure doesn't only come from externally, it comes from the internal interpretation of the external. And a lot of that is under the radar, it's subconscious. So, popular culture, all the things that have influenced us over the years, all the movies we watch, the songs we hear, the pictures we see, all of that, it builds this kind of image of what we'll be as a mother. And then if we're not that, which we most often are not, we can fall apart. And I think it's a huge and kind of under-discussed contribution to the fact of postpartum depression being, over 50% of women will have mental health issues following motherhood, traumatic births also, because again, we're fed this idea of a birth in all of the movies that isn't, not only is it nothing like a real birth, it's not helpful in a real birth. You don't see women vocalizing in deep whale-like tones. That's what helps you with a birth, not screaming and shouting and, all the stuff you see in movies. That's not helpful. It's just not what works. And we're not shown what works. And I think it's the same with so many things of motherhood. And I also kind of have this weigh in on this as well, which is about, feminism. I think we often feel like first wave feminism was, it fought for the right to work. It fought for the right for women to be in the world, because women had been kind of in the home in the 50s, But I actually really am not sure that's right. I mean, I actually think that feminism was really about fighting for the right to choose whether we stay home or not, which is an incredibly, again, neoliberal, very high privilege socioeconomically to be able to choose to be at home with your children. What a ridiculously financially, inequitable situation that is. That's, we might have single parenting pension, for example, will allow a single mother to stay home with their kids. Incredible privilege that we have in this country to have that. Nonetheless, that is a privilege, and it's one that is a valid choice. But I remember when I made that choice feeling really judged for doing so.
Yeah, I can imagine.
And it's crazy, that stuff.
Yeah, it is. And because it also brings it back down again to the individual. And
right.
I can't help it. I've been hearing a lot about the idea of the universal basic income and what that might do. And especially if you could think about it as actually being community wealth rather than individual wealth.
Yes.
What would happen if a whole community was getting funds, and you go, you know what we need? We actually need like more family daycare, or we need to be able to have more sharing of all childcare duties or something. And that means that some people can stay at home and be artists and be just creative, or just be thinking and contributing to the community in a way that isn't financial.
Yeah, this is interesting because what you're touching on now, I think in my mind anyway, what it touches on is the way that we undervalue the vulnerable. So we kind of seem to want to marginalize the needy. You know, we want the homeless people to sleep in a shelter. We want the mothers who need help to be institutionalized, not to be cared for by the community. We want old people to be institutionalized, not to be cared for by the community. It's about the way that we marginalize the vulnerable, and we undervalue carers. You know, carers are so paid so badly, and they do one of the most important jobs in the world. They look after humans, you know. Like, it's a really important job.
Carers of all kinds. So
that's right.
Teaching
that's
as well.
Right.
If you
that's
think about,
exactly right.
Yeah. Teaching, nursing, caring. Yeah. And
correct.
Oh, look, they're industries that predominantly employ women. I can't imagine, Elena, why people undervalue them.
I know, right? So, and the biggest unpaid job of all, mothering, you know.
Yeah.
So, and again, it's not a job, right? But the labor, the amount of hours. I remember I had a really funny experience once. We went for life insurance. We went in for a financial consultation with a major bank, and it was a woman who was sitting there, and she said to my husband, who had a fairly well paid job at the time, do you, we need to definitely insure your income, because, if you became sick, then that would be a huge loss to the family. And it came around to my turn. There's not really any point insuring you because you don't earn any money. I was irate, because there I am, like, spending 24/7 hours a day, every day of the year, working to support our family, right? And I went home and I calculated, and I'm sure other women have done this. I calculated, I've written job descriptions since, like ironic job descriptions, if motherhood was a job, this is the ad, like, must be prepared to be watched while going to the toilet, must be prepared to be woken any moment of the day or night for consultation, like all these kind. If it was a job, it's ridiculous, And I calculated all of the services that my husband would need if I wasn't here. It was worth way more than he earned.
Yeah.
So, and this is not a new idea, but like, when you have it, actually experience it, it's just insane. And I think, what you're talking about overall, as far as I can see, is the way that we generally have to have a different way of looking at care and looking at support, community support, looking at money and the way we distribute money to support our values. And I think at the moment they're supporting the values of a few marginal few. And it would be good if the systems in place supported a few more people,
Yeah, absolutely. It's I've been reading a bit about the idea of an ethics of care. And I'll just read you this great quote, which is a description of what care is. So this is from two women, Joan Tronto and Bernice Fisher. And they define care as everything that we do to maintain, continue, and repair our world so that we can live in it as well as possible.
How beautiful.
That world includes our bodies, ourselves, and our environment. And somebody else has said that care is a valuable and necessary part of living with and alongside others.
Right. Right.
Yeah. And it's an active practice as well, like to care, like you're actually doing something. You're not just sitting back and going, I care for you. Like, if you're caring for somebody, you have to do something about it.
So true. There was a great quote I saw a little while ago about, shouting self-care at women who have no care from others is like blah, blah, blah. It was like a meme. But I just thought, my God, it's so true. We so often say self-care, self-care, self-care. I don't need bloody self-care. I need someone else to care,
Yeah. Because it's the thing you also choose, right? You choose who you care for and what you care for, which means that you're also not caring for something else. So,
right. And it's sort of economies of scale.
Yeah. But it is something, as I said before, that has been devalued because it's considered women's work.
Right, agreed. And here we are tipping into a conversation around feminism and patriarchal structures and all this, which we could talk for days about, I am sure. And I do love talking about this, although I do feel also sometimes like I'm just like I could talk and talk for days, but it is what it is, right? So what I love about the work that you're doing is that you're working within and around and through the structures that are in place. Despite the government in Australia making choices that prioritise coal, despite the financial systems that we live in potentially prioritising coal, you're finding a way through, around and within to make a little bit of a difference. And I just really applaud you for that.
Thank you.
I think it's a really amazing thing. And I again, like I say, I reckon we could talk all day, but we probably should go and do some other stuff and let other people do the same.
Yeah.
But I've loved talking to you today, Kimberley. Is there anything else you wanted to add before we wrap up?
No, I'm sure that there'll be many things that I think about. Oh, I should have said that.
Yeah, there will. And if you think of anything you want me to add, I'll definitely put a post up on my blog on the website, soulmamahub.com, and about this conversation and linking to the books and the various people that you've mentioned. And if anyone wants to know more, they can just head over there. And I just want to say thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure to speak with you.
Thank you for inviting me. It's been lovely.
This is the lady who was like not quite sure what we were going to talk about. And I was like, I'm sure we'll find something. It's awesome to have you. So Kimberley, I'll also put your details if anyone wants to know more about you. I'll put your details also into that blog post. And again, thank you so much. That's the end of the podcast for today. And please share, rate, review, whatever it is that you do to engage with podcasts and get these messages shared around, because I think they're really big, important messages. Thanks again, Kimberley.
Thank you.